This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Neil James. I'm from the Plain English Foundation, the sponsors of today's session, and it's my very great pleasure to be chairing this session on the spin cycle in our public language. Or perhaps to put a more appropriate spin on this session, today's focus group will endeavour to exercise continuous engagement with a view to identifying the appropriate touch points moving forward and to facilitate on-message communications at this point in time. In short, we will be wondering when we cross that line from plain speaking to painful obfuscation. Was there ever a golden age of clarity, or is it just that the spin cycle is getting faster and the detergent more corrosive? Is the language of spin inevitable, or can we contain it? Well, to tackle these topics today are former Federal Finance Minister Lindsay, former advertising copywriter Jane Caro, and former editor of just about every financial paper in Australia, Trevor Sykes. But since spin is the order of the day, we might also dub them the man who did his best to put Australia back in the black, a woman who has shown how the original Elizabeth put the spin into spinster, and the man who has done more than most to expose the financial sleaze of corporate Australian scandals. Together, our focus group will dissect the spin we are all forced to endure in the worlds of politics and the media, of business and high finance. And on that note, let's begin with the cutting edge of the Australian spin cycle, the world of politics and its codependent relationship with the media. It's a relationship that gave us two of the most immortal lines of 2010. Firstly, when quizzed about the deportation of asylum seekers last year, our Minister for Immigration was at pains to avoid the D word, instead explaining these people were simply, quote, on a removal pathway. Not to be outdone, the opposition spokesperson defended the introduction of a tax for paid maternity leave by saying, well, we don't call it a tax, we're calling it an investment in human capital. Now, to explain why perfectly intelligent people would make such statements in front of a camera, we thought we should ask one. And in Lindsay, we have a man who has been there, done that, and has now written about it. As Australia's former finance minister, he was one of the gang of four at the centre of the Rudd government. This is a man who probably even knows what detailed programmatic specificity actually means. His books include The Politics of Pollution, Crowded Lives, Open Australia, and now Sideshow. Dumbing Down Democracy. Men and women of Australia, please, will you join me in welcoming Lindsay Tanner.
Thanks very much, Neil, and thank you to all of you for being here today and showing that, like me, you care about ideas, care about issues, care about public discourse. The genesis of my book is really, I think, something that is a sentiment that's widely shared in our community, and that is despair at the current state of political debate in this country and the current state of public life, and particularly encapsulated in that notorious word spin, but also other words like robotic and script and all of those other kinds of things, and we just heard a couple of fairly good examples of it from Neil. What I set out to do is to try and explain why this is getting worse. There's no golden age of politics. Theatre, misrepresentation, distortion have always been part of politics, always been part of media portrayal of politics. But I believe these things in our country, and to some degree in many others, have got a lot worse in the last decade or so. So what I set out to do was to try and unravel why this was happening, try and understand what was going on. 3 or 4 years ago, I was angry about it, and I was particularly angry at the media because I was at the heart of this process. But as I started to think more about it, I got less angry and just more, I suppose, concerned about a cycle in which we're all partly to blame. Yes, politicians and the media are central to it, but we all make some contribution. The causation chain goes something like this. The media feels, by and large, that it is obliged to report politics, particularly national politics, but it regards issues, the substance of public debate, as inherently boring, And in order to sell newspapers, win ratings, it has to basically magnify, distort, and turn these things into entertainment. And if it is necessary to literally have people being portrayed as saying the opposite of what they are actually saying, so be it. If they have to present politicians like celebrities, so be it. If they have to encourage politicians to put on a funny hat or prance around in Speedos and the Surf Lifesavers cap in order to get on the TV, so be it. The problem is that media are the oxygen of politics. Only a politician can really truly understand just how much power the media have. If you do not get access to the media, you do not exist as a politician. The percentage of people who feel they know me, as compared with who have actually met me, of course, is massively disproportionate. The only reason the vast majority of people who do know I exist know that is through the media, not because they've met me personally. So the media decide whether or not I or other politicians get their message through and what that message will consist of. And this is one of the great furphies that I think is really important to shoot down in this discussion. The media are not just the messenger. They decide what the message is. They decide who gets a voice and who doesn't. They decide whether what that person says or does is conveyed accurately and fairly, or whether it is massively distorted and grotesquely twisted in order to make the story more exciting, more titillating, more interesting. They decide what the spin is. And what the phenomenon of spin from politicians, that kind of obfuscation and evasive language and ducking and weaving and refusing to answer questions, that is essentially a defensive reaction by the political class to the way it is treated in the media. Nobody is innocent here, and yes, politicians could do better, but it's important to understand that it is not just politicians. The factors that are driving this are technological change. The media are, by and large, or particularly the traditional mass media, are under a lot more competitive pressure than they used to be, and therefore the pressure to sex things up, to tart things up, to make them more exciting and interesting, and to ignore or gloss over core facts is greater than it's ever been. Public complacency is a factor. We've had no serious economic downturn in this country for 20 years. And therefore the appetite for entertainment is probably at an all-time high. The appetite for serious discussion about solutions to our nation's problems is not exactly overwhelming. Solutions will not be easy to find, and in many respects we should avoid the temptation to think that there is some kind of ready-made elixir sitting up on the shelf that all we have to do is take 2 teaspoons full and the problem will be solved. In some respects, distortion, entertainment, manipulation of content is inherent in the political process. Politicians have been modifying the content of their argument to suit their circumstances since democratic politics started in ancient Greece, and they won't stop doing that. But I want to cite to you a few examples to illustrate the essence of what I'm saying, just to make the point as to why this is a serious issue for this country. In the wake of the Queensland floods, we had endless coverage, endless debate about who cried and who didn't cry. Anna Bligh was deemed to have set, literally in a feature article in The Australian, deemed to have set new world standards in disaster response by not what her government actually did, but by how she presented, including crying at the appropriate time, all those kind of things. So you've literally got this serious newspaper publishing this drivel saying that new world standards of response to disasters by politicians are being set, when it is not about rebuilding, it's not about saving people whose lives are at risk, it's not about helping people who've lost their homes, it's actually about how the politicians appeared. And that tells you everything you need to know, that appearances are taking over the actual substance of public debate. And of course Julia Gillard was marked down because she didn't cry and Anna Bligh did. Now, believe it or not, I've actually been a flood victim. I was pretty young at the time. I don't recall wondering about which politicians were crying or not at the time. And I'm sure most people in Queensland and Victoria were not really that concerned. They were worrying about what governments might do, not how the politicians might appear. A second example. I woke up one morning about 18 months ago, flipped through the Financial Review, and I saw this big headline, "Tanner embroiled in Windsor scandal." And no, I'm not a member of the royal family, you'll be pleased to know. And I kind of looked at this and took a double take, and what on earth is this about? A big project behind the Windsor Hotel in Melbourne had become controversial. There'd been a certain amount of embarrassing stuff for the state government. I'd had absolutely nothing to do with it, all planning issues, so nothing to do with federal matters. I knew very little about it. Somehow I was embroiled. It turned out that the way I was embroiled was that a man who was a qualified architect in good public repute, who was on a review panel that had been set up to reassess the project's merits, had happened to have been active in one or two of my election campaigns. He was not accused of any wrongdoing, but somehow, because there was a connection between him and this controversy, an entirely innocent one, and then between him and me, I was embroiled in this scandal. In February last year, I think my last Q&A as a minister, I was up against Barnaby Joyce, who you might recall for a short time was Shadow Finance Minister. And a journalist from the Good Weekend was following him around, doing one of those big profiles they do in the Good Weekend, those of you who read the Herald or any people from down south who read the Age. And my media advisor was just chatting to her and sort of had a bit of a niggle at her and said, well, you know, why don't you do one of these big profiles of Lindsay? And her answer was, Lindsay's too normal. And I heard this. Thankfully, I was kind of halfway out the door of the political scene anyway, so by this stage I didn't care very much, but I heard this and I wasn't sure whether to take it as a compliment or an insult. But it tells you all you need to know about what is driving these characters. So they want a freak show. And unfortunately, the silly hat that I was prepared to put on was not quite as silly as Barnaby's hat. Another example, you might recall the famous public brawl between Tracy Grimshaw and Gordon Ramsay, a matter of earth-shattering national importance. I read this fantastic editorial in The Age at the peak of this debate complaining about this awful person, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who had actually made public comments about this spat and I think called Ramsay a cad or something like that. And this editorial, in a style that only The Age can manage, sort of lectured Kevin Rudd about, you know, the Prime Ministership is much too important to be dragged down into this trivial populist rubbish. And of course, what it failed to point out was that The Age had dutifully reported his comments, I think on page 3, about all of this, and it also failed to point out that it wasn't Kevin Rudd who asked him a question, what do you think about Tracy Grimshaw and Gordon Ramsay? So much of the media are blissfully unaware of how trivialising and how distorting and how ultimately ridiculous their behaviour is. You'll recall that when Kim Beazley lost the leadership of the Labor Party to Kevin Rudd, one of the precursors was that he expressed his regrets at a press conference to Rove McManus regarding the sad death of his partner Belinda Emmett. Unfortunately, Kim got his lines mangled and referred to Karl Rove, who was George Bush's political guru. And of course, he got hammered from all sides. Nobody thought to ask, why in the hell, at a press conference, was the Leader of the Opposition talking about Rove McManus and Belinda Emmett? What have they got to do with Australian politics? Well, the answer, nothing. The answer to why was he doing it is to try and make sure that he could attract some media attention. And if the media are not going to cover you talking about serious things, well, slip yourself into the world of entertainment. That's why you more and more see politicians on light entertainment shows. Because if that's the way you communicate with the public, if it's the only way you can actually convey to them that you exist and what your name is, then yes, you go on Good News Week, you go on talking about my generation, you go on Are You Smarter Than the Fifth Grader? Because that's how you explain to people that you exist. And my final example, and I'll conclude on this point, and with one exception, this will be the penultimate point. And this is a more serious one. My colleague Nick Sherry, good mate and a very good minister, was the subject of an attack article in the Business Age about 18 months ago again that said, Sherry dined with Macquarie Bank a week before government decided to guarantee bank deposits. The tone of the article was extremely condemnatory. It was basically, you know, look, there's dodgy behaviour, corrupt behaviour going on here. And what it sought to assert was that Macquarie Bank benefited from the decision to guarantee bank deposits at the height of the global financial crisis. Nick Sherry was Assistant Treasurer at the time. Therefore, the fact that he'd had dinner with some Macquarie Bank executives was highly suspicious and therefore to be condemned and implicitly corrupt. What it didn't point out was that Nick Sherry was not a member of Cabinet. He was not involved in any way in the decision to guarantee bank deposits. And ministers like him, like me, like Wayne Swan, economic ministers have those kind of functions, lunches, dinners, with major companies, including banks, all the time as part of the job. And so you have somebody who is literally, in effect, or implicitly being accused of corrupt behaviour for absolutely zero reason. So in many instances, this is more than just silly. It is pretty much bordering on character assassination. Now, I just want to conclude by referring to some of the headlines that greeted my book. In the introduction, I said that here's how journalists will approach this. They'll skim through the book. They won't read it, but they'll skim through it looking for something they can sort of distort into a Tanner attacks headline. And predictably enough, we got Tanner attacks leaders, Tanner Savage in book, Lindsay Tanner Savage's leaders, media in new book, Tanner targets party, etc. And tiny little snippets pulled out and massively distorted in order to imply that I was actually criticising Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd or whatever, when that was made explicitly clear that I wasn't. So, in a sense, the thesis of the book being confirmed by the reaction. And there have been a few other entertaining ones, like Peter Van Onselen in The Australian suggesting that I may have resigned, left Parliament because in protest at the decision to abandon the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Now, if that were true, I think this would be a first in Australian politics, possibly in world politics. Somebody resigns in protest and doesn't tell anybody why they're doing it. Normally, when people do that, they make a bit of a fuss about the reason they're resigning. Of course, that wasn't the reason I left. The reason I left was the public reason, my commitment to my family. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll look forward to some further discussion and the contributions of our other panellists.
And I have to say, Lindsay, you'll never be just normal to us. Talking about the Queensland floods, I think one of the best sort of forms of revenge that was meted out to the media during that coverage was on Facebook, where a group of people set up a flood drinking game for watching Channel 9, and whenever they used the word inundate, you had to take a drink. Two skulls if they used the word inland tsunami. A lot of people got very drunk. Also, of course, far from normal is our next speaker. And if our panel of Spinmeister experts today were a sporting team, our next speaker would be the genuine all-rounder, the Capel Dev, if you like, of the Writers' Festival Focus Group. Jane Caro can line up for the batting side as a columnist and commentator, a lecturer and an author, but she can equally well come out to bowl as an advertising copywriter, a television and radio presenter, and now a young adult novelist. The common thread, of course, is words. Words about education, about politics, about advertising, about media, about language, in fact, about just about anything. In the 1970s, when she graduated with a degree in English and went into advertising, she admitted that some of her peers thought she may as well be going out and murdering babies. But in a recent profile piece, she told Tim Dick that her advertising career actually taught her there is a difference between good and bad spin. And Jane also knows something of the history of spin. Her latest book, Just a Girl, which is about the early life of Elizabeth I, and how Elizabeth I built one of the most successful and enduring early political brands. Coming in to strengthen the middle order of today's batting lineup, would you please join me in welcoming Jane Caro.
That's the first time I've ever been compared with anyone who can catch and throw. As Neil pointed out, I come to you from the lowest rung of the media. Yes, I represent the most honest of the dishonest professions. After all, in advertising, you all know we're trying to sell you something. And that may be a bit of a difference to the way we appear in the media as in some other ways. But when I was thinking about this presentation, I thought, how am I going to approach this? And I thought, well, stick to your knitting, Jane. Talk about what you know. And so I'm going to give you the 8 simple rules for marketing anything, including politicians, political beliefs and political parties. Some of them will strike you as surprising. In fact, I hope all of them do. And then I will talk about why these represent good spin over bad spin. The first rule is always more honoured in the breach than the actual delivery, but it is the first rule of marketing anything, and it is under promise and over deliver. This is about managing expectations. Everyone who is selling anything or trying to persuade anyone to do anything should think very hard about what they're promising and make sure that they promise a little less than they're sure that they can deliver. Because it doesn't matter how much you promise. If you actually don't meet it, you will create disappointment and anger. If you over-deliver even by a nanosecond, if you get an extra chocolate with your morning coffee just once in a while, you will be happy and come back. It's not about how much you promise, it's that you give a little more. The second rule is be voter-centred. Now, this doesn't mean that you research voters and parrot back to them what they said they wanted in order to get elected. Because if you think about what that is, that's actually you're self-focused. That's actually, how do I manipulate what those idiots out there are saying and make it sound like I believe it too, so they'll vote for me and I'll actually win. So it is the opposite of being voted-centred to do that. To be voted-centred actually means you need to step back and out of the control seat. You need to present your ideas for improving society as you believe them as truthfully as you can, and you need to convince voters that you genuinely have those ideas because you put them first. Successful brands actually do that. They convince the people who buy them that they put the people who buy them first. Malcolm Turnbull and Bob Brown strike me as 2 politicians that voters believe have their best interests at heart. It doesn't actually mean that those voters necessarily agree with Bob Brown or agree with Malcolm Turnbull, but they have a sense of them putting voters first. And that's because they both take risks in defence of what they believe. They put their career at risk for what they believe. The third rule is don't sacrifice what your core users always liked about you to buy new users. There are a great many brands that have completely disappeared by doing this. One of the basic problems of selling any product or service is that you have a kind of life cycle. And when you start to get to the end of your life cycle and you get a bit old-fashioned and out of favour, you think we've got to make ourselves look young and hip and get the young users in. Most of those brands end up looking like a middle-aged man just divorced with a comb over. And it is a classic mistake that political parties make. They take their core users for granted. They think, well, they haven't got anyone else to vote for, so we don't have to pay any attention to them. We have to go out and get those swinging voters, those people who don't really like us very much, change our policies and seduce them. The trouble is they'll never really like you. They might buy you occasionally because you offer them a carrot or a lower price or a bigger pack or, a stop the boats kind of a policy. But they won't really believe you believe it. And as soon as the other side offers you something a little bit more attractive, they're off. That's their nature. They swing. They're not loyal. They don't stick with you. Meanwhile, the people who've always voted for you because they believed in what they thought you stood for are flowing out the back door to another brand that's offering them what they always cared about. Peter Harcher has an article in the Sydney Morning Herald's review section today about precisely that. And that's what the Labor Party is currently suffering from. They ignored their core users. The other one, many of you in the room will hate to hear, but all advertising people know this is fundamentally true. All purchase decisions, and a vote is a purchase decision, are made emotionally and then post-rationalised. Yes, you like to think you're clever, don't you? And that you're, ruled by your intellect, not your heart. No, sorry, don't care how many degrees you've got, don't care what your IQ is, you're just as emotional as the rest of us. There are two emotions that change behaviour: hope and fear. The reason there are two emotions that change behaviour is because they're the two future-oriented emotions. And a lot of people like to believe that fear is bad, and so spin that uses fear is bad spin, and hope is good. And people who use hope are using good spin. Rubbish. How simplistic is that? I think hope and fear are probably the same different sides of the same coin. Fear is when you look at the future with a feeling of dread, anxiety. And hope is when you look at the future with a feeling of excitement and expectation. And to some extent, we all do both all of the time. That's what the future's like. So when you're trying to change behaviour, change a vote, or maintain behaviour, keep a vote, you need to know that what you're dealing with all the time is people's hopes and fears. That's what they're operating on. I mean, people... And the problem is that governments and oppositions, therefore, are placed in an interesting situation. By and large, governments have to sell on fear because their basic position is, you might not like us very much, but they're worse. It's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know is basically what governments sell on. Oppositions generally sell on hope. We can offer you something new and different and better. Think of Kevin 07, that was an absolutely hope-driven campaign. Think of Obama's Yes We Can, a hope-driven campaign. Who knew that it was going to turn out that what he meant was, yes, we can kill Osama. I'm sure all those Oprah-loving, candle-waving voters didn't realise that's what he meant. I don't think he meant it, but you know what I mean. I think that there are problems with both of those. When you sell on hope, and hope is the riskier position in politics, because when you sell on hope, of course, you very quickly get into the danger of over-promising and under-delivering. As soon as I heard Obama's slogan, Yes We Can, I started to worry about him. I started to worry that he could only disappoint because he was promising so much and so many expectations were being placed on him from so many people who were projecting a whole lot of stuff. I worried that his kind of leadership was already fighting uphill with that kind of slogan. We have a strange situation in Australia, however, because what we have at the moment is an opposition that's using fear. That's how they're kind of running their campaign at the moment, and a government that's trying to sell us some hope, which is the opposite from how it usually works. And I've been thinking about this because it kind of interests me. And I suspect that it's because it still feels to us, and remember this is about emotion, not thought, it still feels to us as if the Liberals are the legitimate government, a hangover from Howard, and we're still not quite sure that we really feel the Gillard government is legitimate yet. I know that people hate people saying that. This is about feeling, not fact. Number 5 is, whilst all purchase decisions are made emotionally and then post-rationalised, you must give purchasers ammunition to defend their choice. So policy is important, just as the facts and figures about brands and services are important too. It won't actually necessarily change anyone's vote, not fundamentally, but what it does is it gives people a way of post-rationalising, of rationalising why they've made the purchase decision they have. They mostly have to do that post-rationalising to themselves. It's actually how we kind of soothe our own anxieties about the decision we've made, is to tell ourselves it's about this policy or that policy or the other. The next rule is raise voters' morale and your own. We want to vote for people who look like they want the job, and once they've got the job, look like they love the job. Some of the people I can think of who gave us that impression extremely strongly was John Howard. Whether you agree or disagree with him, he looked like he loved being Prime Minister. Ronald Reagan, he always looked like he was having a hell of a time. People like that. It gives them confidence. You know, you might hate the guy, you might hate his policies, you might wish he got voted out, but on an emotional level, there's a confidence in someone who looks like they're having a good time while they're doing it. Bob Hawke is another person who really looked like he revelled in the work that he was doing. This raises not just their party's morale, but the entire country's morale. I heard A.A. Gill the other morning, and he said something very interesting that no one's really talking about in Australia. Maybe only an outsider could say it. He was talking about how much he hates costume dramas, but he said he hated them only when he was in England. He didn't mind them so much when he came here. And the reason was not that we make better costume dramas, but that in Britain they're symbolic of the fact that Britain is a profoundly pessimistic society that believes that their best days are in the past. He said Australia is a profoundly optimistic society because you believe your best days are in the future. I loved that and I thought, he's right. Why don't we talk more about that? And that would help us raise what I see as a kind of sinking morale across the nation, and that worries me. The corollary to raising voter morale and your own is you need to lower voter anxiety about you. Now, I know I said hope and fear are what changes behaviour. You want to make people frightened of your opponent, but you want them to feel less anxious about you. Howard promised to make us feel relaxed and comfortable. What he didn't tell us was he wasn't going to make us feel relaxed and comfortable about the world. He was going to make us feel relaxed and comfortable about him. And to a large extent, he succeeded, and that's why he survived so long. At the moment, I think voters are anxious about both our leaders. Sometimes I feel like that the public are angry because they've actually got the leaders of both political parties they don't want. They want Malcolm Turnbull leading the Liberals and Kevin Rudd leading Labor, and they're going to keep being sort of sulky about it until it happens. And the other thing that happens, and I blame my industry for this, is pseudo-scientific approach to marketing, which, by the way, is garbage in advertising and has just about killed the creativity of it anyway, and it's terrible to see it bringing its dead hand over the rest of the world. But the problem is that the more you try to control and manage how you appear, the more you try to resist the real human fluidity and riskiness of human communication, the more anxiety and suspicion you create. The more you don't look real, the more you look false and forced and use all that horrible language Neil showed us, the more people feel anxious about you. And the more they come after you to find out the truth, the more you try to control it, the more they try to break down your control. So in a way, the media and politics are in this horrible little dance where the politicians try to protect themselves, which only makes the media more suspicious, so they attack them further and further and further. One side's got to stop it. I think it's got to be the politicians, and they've got to change. It's no good saying, you lot change out there. That never works in life. It's always about you changing you. The last rule is that voters want politicians to love their constituency, their community. I disagree profoundly with Lindsay about the reaction to Anna Bligh. It had nothing to do with her tears. It had to do with the fact that she proved she loved Queensland. That is what sent her popularity up. The fact that she was so moved that she cried, which is what chicks do, Lindsay.
You may have noticed there's a few men that do it occasionally too.
Yeah, indeed.
I think the only Prime Ministers who've cried publicly are both men.
Yes, Hawke, and we believed him when he cried too. It's because she proved that she loved the place. I was thinking about this. Who are our leaders who have proved their love of their constituency, their community, whether we agree with them or not? Hawke. I believe he loved Australia and Australians, that he was proud of Australia. He loved it, all of it, faults and all, loved it. He had many of those faults himself. Still has, no doubt. John Howard, I think he proved that he loved Australia, even if you didn't love him. I think he was determined to love you, like it or not.
He hugged everybody.
Bjelke-Petersen, nut job that he was. He loved Queensland. How did he stay in power that long? Because Queenslanders thought he loved them. Yeah, I don't like him either. This isn't about what I like or don't like. I think the US presidents get this completely, that they have to prove that they love America. Sometimes it makes us feel a bit icky. And I think progressives on the left are particularly uncomfortable with patriotism. But I don't care whether it's patriotism that it's about. It's about you actually loving who you're serving. You can't say it because love is not really a feeling, it's an action. You have to do it. Two people I think who absolutely exemplify it in the modern world, Nelson Mandela. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he loved South Africa, and not just that he loved South Africa, he loved all South Africans, black, white, whatever their political beliefs. That's an extraordinary example of it. And Aung San Suu Kyi. I think there's no doubt she loves her community, her country, and the idea of democracy. I'm saying these rules are simple, but I'm not saying they're easy. It's really hard. I'm not a politician. I don't ever want to be a politician because I couldn't live up to this standard. But I think it's very important to keep these core, simple ideas at the bottom of everything you do, and remember that it's not actually about that good persuasion, good selling is not about control. It's not about who you manipulate. It's about where you come from. And if you come from the right place, it is my perhaps naive belief that eventually the rest of the world will see that too. I continue to hold on to that. Thank you for listening.
I think you'd all agree with me that Jane certainly over-delivered there and has made us all very relaxed and comfortable, to the point where we could say, don't you worry about that. My favourite Joeism worth sharing at this point, of course, is when he said, we have to get the status quo back to the way it was before. Our next speaker, of course, has spent a lot of time looking at what the status quo was like before in the financial world. When we think about spin, it's not surprising, I guess, that the world of politics most readily leaps to mind. But the corporate and financial world is seldom very far behind. When BP was knee-deep in damage control over its oil spill in the Mexican Gulf, it named the support program for the ruined local fishing fleet the Vessels of Opportunity program. During the global financial crisis, subprime mortgages were made much more palatable to investors by being dubbed asset-backed or structured finance securities. The most attractive of them were in some place called the mezzanine tranche. General Motors, when it announced that it was filing for bankruptcy, sent out the now immortal line in a press release to its stakeholders, and it said, and I quote, "As you know, GM is using an expedited court-supervised process to accelerate the reinvention of our company." i.e., we just filed for bankruptcy. Australia is extremely fortunate that although Trevor Sykes retired as a financial journalist in 2005, he was on hand to chronicle how Australia fell prey to the worst excesses of adjustable rate mortgages, credit default swaps and collateralised debt obligations. The resulting book, 6 Months of Panic, How the Global Financial Crisis Hit Australia, an absolute must-read for anyone interested in how that happened, and also a weighty enough tome to be used in hand-to-hand combat. It follows a distinguished series of titles Trevor has written on Australian corporate collapses. Today, Australia's preeminent corporate critic will give us the good oil on how spin doctors can make bad business reports seem brilliant and how euphemisms can disguise financial reality. Would you please welcome Australia's living financial treasure, Trevor Sykes.
Thank you for that introduction. So far we have heard all about political spin, but I must say, as a denizen of the financial world, that corporate spin beats it hollow. In corporations we see more spin than you will in a two-up school. We regard the political spin as being amateur hour because ours is professional. It's much more expensive, mainly for the investors. Now, I've been covering the financial world for 42 years. And today I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, you can time me if you like, on just one of those years' examples of spin. Admittedly, it was a vintage year, 2008, when Lehman Brothers hit the wall. But let's start with a classic statement by the US investment bank Bear Stearns. He produced a handout headed, "Bear Stearns Denies Liquidity Rumours," and that read, "The Bear Stearns Companies Inc. today denied market rumours regarding the firm's liquidity. The company stated there is absolutely no truth to the rumours of liquidity problems that circulated today in the market. Alan Swartz, president and CBO of the Bear Stearns Companies Inc., said, Bear Stearns' balance sheet, liquidity and capital remain strong." That press release was dated Monday, March 10, when Bear Stearns shares were still trading above $60 US. On Friday, March 14, Bear Stearns agreed to accept a $2 a share offer from JP Morgan. Later it was jacked up to $10, but there was still room to doubt whether the original press statement was accurate at all. It looked like they did have severe liquidity problems. Profit forecasts are notoriously rubbery. Take ABC Learning, which I quote in the book there. In February 2008, it forecast a 15% rise in net profit for the financial year to around $160 million. At the end of July, they revised that to a loss of $430 million. And in November they went into receivership. The most disastrous attempts at spin I've ever seen in the corporate world was by Michael King, who was then the chief executive of the MFS investment group. As 2008 dawned, unbeknown to the market, MFS did actually have a few liquidity problems of its own. King decided that what was needed was a bit of positive spin, and being surrounded by acolytes, no one was game to point out the defects in his proposed approach. Actually, indeed, the spin was already reasonably good because although MFS shares had dropped to $3.94, Macquarie Equities, part of Macquarie Bank, had tipped MFS as an outperformed stock on January 15, saying the shares should be valued at a target of $7.14. But King decided to give the stock a bit further boost by holding a grand teleconference for investors and journalists to announce a group restructure. The teleconference opened at 10 a.m. on January 18, just 4 days after the Macquarie $7.14 prescription, 3 days, after the optimistic tip by Macquarie. King, in the teleconference, announced that MFS would be split by spinning off its stellar travel business and recapitalised by raising $550 million in equity to pay down debt. The analysts were surrounded by the size of the proposed issue in what was a very dodgy market at the start of 2008. The teleconference lasted 67 minutes, and in that time, King's announcement drove MFS shares from $3.75 to 71 cents, which must be some sort of a record. The company was mortally wounded, struggled on for 8 months, but eventually threw in the sponge and appointed administrators in September. Those overpaid chief executives can put positive spin on anything. Take the example of David Robb, chief executive of the mineral sands group Iluka, who said in my 16 months, I've done a terrific job of lowering the share price. So that in itself represents a great opportunity for investors. That was supposed to be an incentive to take up shares in a rights issue they were having. Nor should we forget the chairman of Lend-Lease, the frightfully respected David Crawford, who told the annual meeting of Lend-Lease that profits would be maintained in financial 09 by recycling capital. It took me a minute to work out what he actually meant. Then I realised that it meant profit would not be maintained by the tedious business of making profits in their daily business. It would be profits made by selling assets. I've used the word overpaid a couple of times already. The problem here is that the corporate world seems to have forgotten the meaning of the word incentive. In my day, an incentive was something you got paid for after you'd done a good job. The chief executive of Transurban Holdings, Kim Edwards, left the company with $15 million in bonuses and increments on top of his $1.3 million salary. 2 months earlier, the Toll Road Group announced it would slash distributions from 58 cents to 22 cents. Kim's handouts included a $5 million strategic milestone incentive plan bonus, which you might like to add to your dictionary there, and a 3.2 million business generation plan incentive. That presumably was their description of Transurban improving its result. It only lost $140 million for the year, but that was a 6% improvement on the year before. Another deserving chap was an old mate of mine, Vic Alexander, Managing Director of Minerals Corporation, who starred in a few Pierpont columns. He collected nearly $900,000 in base salary and incentives, including an incentive of $530,000. Not bad considering that Minerals Corporation's external sales were only $900,000 also. And it chalked up a loss of $20 million. Heaven knows how they would have performed if Vic had not been incentivised. Vic, by the way, spent over a decade saying he was going to develop the Skardon River kaolin deposit in North Queensland, and never did. The float of that year, 2008, we're still in 2008, it's all 2008, was the Rewards Factory, which claimed it was I quote here, a leader in the provision of loyalty-based solutions, value-added marketing and membership marketing. The only trouble was it couldn't market its own shares. It just couldn't inspire much loyalty amongst its float subscribers. The Rewards Factory on June 20, 6 months after the prospectus was issued, it listed at that stage, but then it went into trading halt on August the 8th. And if you count them carefully, it then went into voluntary suspension on August 13, after which the company advised it had not actually received most of the funds that it sought in the prospectus. The company had issued 15.7 million shares under the prospectus, but it hadn't been paid for 14.2 million of them. That's a shortfall. So the Reward Factory was quoted for a total of just 47 days, including weekends, which entitled it to a listing in Pierpont's Mayfly Hall of Fame. It never did find the outstanding money from the IPO. Now, I'll conclude with a couple of things. My penultimate is an example of spin in employee relations. Consider the case of Ross Reed, an employee at the BP service station in Redfern, who won awards from the company for contributions above and beyond the call of duty. He was also described as a successful example of the company's publicised Indigenous employment program. BP then sacked him for taking a $2.40 discount on a packet of cigarettes. Employees were forbidden from taking discounts. Finally, I'll give you some of the prize quotations of 2008. Not all of them are spin, but I think you might find a few of them amusing. From Jerry Harvey, I'd line them all up against a wall, all the short sellers, and shoot them. ABC Learning's Chief Executive Eddie Groves, I got a few holes in my pants, but I got out with my pants on. John O'Sullivan, Chairman of Investment Banking at Credit Suisse, bad people will find a way around the law no matter how good the law is. Perfectly true. Brian Rear, Managing Director of Copper Co. If copper is a dog and all you produce is copper, then you're a dog. A famous one from the Chief Executive Officer of ANZ, Mike Smith. There are normal banking problems, credit problems which are inevitable in a change cycle, and there are bloody stupid problems like Opus. You want to avoid the bloody stupid ones. We didn't. And finally, I give you Graham Bradley, Chairman of Stockland, with some words that you should remember about margin lending if ever you're tempted into that particular folly. Quote, you get education when you read the fine print and experience when you don't. I thank you.
Well, I think you'd agree that we've certainly avoided all the bloody stupid ones here today, and in fact had a panel made up of some excellent speakers who have incentivised us all to engage in membership marketing and to move forward towards more strategic milestone bonuses, in this case some questions. So we do have some time left for your questions. There are some microphones with the lovely people in the bright orange T-shirts, and we have one over here. Now, I should preface that while the microphone's coming. It's an opportunity to ask a question, please, of our panellists, not to make an extended statement. And please don't make Lindsay's pessimism about the media even worse by asking him to comment on what he thinks about Kevin Rudd and to try and confine your questions on the topic about spin rather than more generally about politics. But we have a question, please, over here.
Thank you. Thank you, all three. Very interesting. My question is about media diversity. I've come back from living in the UK, where the media is both... beg your pardon, where the media is more diverse and varied, both at the tabloid and the quality ends of the market. And could you give me some thoughts on the rather appalling lack of media diversity in Australia and whether this has an impact on the unhelpful dynamic between spin, politics and the media?
That might be one for Lindsay and Jane in particular.
Well, just quickly, I think a couple of things. One, less than you'd think, because I think media diversity is an issue on in other respects. So it's certainly a serious question, but in terms of the problem I've identified, I don't think it's really that critical, because I think it's market dynamics that are dragging the debate down. And if the Daily Telegraph were bought by somebody else other than News Limited, I don't think it would change that much, for example. Secondly, thank God for the ABC and SBS. I think and to be fair to their commercial competitors, one of the reasons the ABC and SBS are good is that, well, SBS has some advertising, of course, but they are largely insulated from these commercial pressures. They have the space to take risks and not to be worried about every, fine movement in ratings and sales and advertising. But I think they are absolutely fundamental to sustaining a reasonably open public discussion in this country.
Jane and Trevor, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd like to butt in for a second, yes. John Howard was probably attacked more by the media than any other Prime Minister in my recollection, and I go back as far as Menzies. He outflanked this. And he says how he did it in his book. He said you could hold a press conference to deliver an important message and it might not be reported at all, or if it was reported, it might be reported with a particular slant on it. And so he resorted to the talkback jockeys. He said, whether you like them or whether you hate them, at least when you're talking to the talkback jockeys, A, you do get your point across, and B, you're probably talking to more people than are going to read the daily papers.
I'd just say that I think we're on the brink of the most enormous media diversity the world's ever seen. I mean, I think what's happening on the internet means that, in a way, this is perhaps an argument that's past its use by date, that the diversity is going to explode. Whether that improves things or doesn't, I think we wait and see.
Another question here.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel if they could please draw the line or define the difference between spinning and lying. Thank you.
Well, being an ex-politician, I'm an expert on this question, of course. Look, I think the notions, this is one of the great furphies of public debate. Politicians typically don't lie. They might play fast and loose with the truth a bit, but to me, a lie is a statement that you know is false. A statement you know is false. And that's actually reasonably rare in politics. Evasion, distortion, manipulation of words. In fact, most politicians go to extraordinary lengths to avoid telling overt lies. So, in fact, a lot of the language that Neil's created is in fact, it's all designed to put up smoke screens to avoid actually overt lying. The second thing I'd point out is that the general public actually don't mind that much that politicians lie. Otherwise, if the common view that politicians do lie was felt to be important, they'd get voted out of office all the time. Australians are pretty pragmatic. When you go to them and say, John Howard lied, as we did, their instinctive response is to say, well, what did he lie about? Because lies are part of human nature. Do I look nice in this dress, darling?
No, Lindsay, you don't.
No, I don't.
But the one you had on earlier was fetching.
That's right. That's right. It was very good. You know, we all use lies in our daily lives to exist, and so the logical, rational question that people ask is, well, yeah, okay, he's told a lie, you reckon? Well, what did he lie about? You know, and often, even if they think the politician's told a lie, they say, well, it doesn't matter. There are bigger things in play here, and that's not an unreasonable point of view.
I think we have the impression that people tell lies when they evade, when they obfuscate, when they use that awful convoluted language that we've been talking about today. We get a sense of that it is in essence a lie. PJ O'Rourke said something wonderful on a Q&A a couple of years ago. He said, beyond a certain point, complexity is fraud. And so as we make our arguments and our discussions so complex no one can understand them, we feel like we're being lied to. We yearn for someone to tell us the blunt, unpalatable truth. And I wonder why so many people lack the courage to do that. All that stuff about it's an opportunity rather than we're bankrupt, that's people who have bought this idea that you must always be relentlessly positive. Great book I can recommend. Barbara Ehrenreich's Smile and Die, which is all about the cult of positivity and how it is destroying basically everything. Stop it. Be negative. Be grumpy. It's much better.
In the corporate world, I agree with Lindsay. If you're saying something is white when you know it is black, you are lying. And I've seen some dreadful cases, none worse than one a few years ago, where a company had been reporting increasing profits for many years, and at least in the last two of those, the directors must have known it was actually making losses. That was a shocker, and I don't think anyone has actually been prosecuted for it.
Of course, they weren't lies, they were simply an inappropriate opinion contrary to on-the-ground evidence. Which is a direct quote from a US military spokesperson. We have another question here, please.
Excuse my ignorance of the legal, of the legalities and the legal responsibilities of politicians and the corporate world, but I heard this question when the Rudd government took over, and I never heard an answer for it. So considering corporate executives can be reprimanded and even prosecuted for failure to competently manage shareholders' dollars, why aren't finance ministers as decision makers, as even public servants as advisors, held accountable for their failure to manage taxpayers' dollars?
That sounds like a question to me.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the premise to your question about people, and I'm sure Trevor will back me up on this, broadly speaking, the premise of the question isn't correct, that you can't get prosecuted running a company for making a mistake. There's a thing called business judgment, and it happens all the time. People make reasonable judgments that they have to make, and sometimes things don't quite turn out as you expect. Secondly, the question of whether or not, whether it's a finance minister, a treasurer, a prime minister, anybody has done a good job, is inherently, unavoidably, 100% subjective. And there is simply no way around that. But the one thing that has always amazed me, and I don't say this in any kind of personal sense, I just mean about the political class generally, it is astonishing how many Australians think, rightly in my view, that we are the greatest country on earth, and yet somehow we have these appalling politicians and appalling governments. Now, maybe it kind of doesn't matter whether governments are any good or not, and we're kind of the best country on earth in spite of our governments. I actually don't think that's right. I think, broadly speaking, Liberal or Labor or whoever, on average, compared with the rest of the world, over history, Australia has generally been pretty well served by its political class. Not perfectly, but pretty well served. The problem is that that is an opinion. It's not a physics experiment. It is not capable of being proved, nor is the alternative view capable of being proved.
I just want to say something very quickly about the concept of accountability. Do you want to clap before I clap?
You can tell she's in advertising.
Do I try to hide it?
They were the ones who saw the dress
haven't
earlier
even
on.
paid her out. Paid her yet, so.
Just very quick point about accountability. This is the mantra. Everyone thinks accountability is a wonderful thing. Accountability is actually all about blame. It's about holding someone to account. It's about prosecuting people for making a mistake. It's about making people afraid and freezing them, so that we now have a society that seeks to avoid failure rather than risk success, and this is really terrible. We need to banish the word accountability, I think, not the concept but the word, and change it to responsibility. Make people responsible for what they do. Therefore, they can make mistakes as long as they do it in a responsible fashion. And it's also about responding rather than pointing a finger and blaming. If we could get rid of that, I reckon everybody would feel a whole lot better.
Making mistakes in the corporate world is not a crime, nor should it be. I mean, if you're in a mining company, for instance, and you say you're going to spend money on the Oodnadatta prospect, and you just go out and you spend all your money on the Oodnadatta prospect and go broke, no one can convict you because you gave the ground a go. Fraud is a crime, but fraud sometimes gets very difficult to prove because there has to be an element of proving that you know what you're doing. Life would be greatly simplified for prosecutors if they could make incompetence a crime, but I don't think we're on the way to that yet.
I know we could keep going, but we are up against time. We've only got about 30 seconds before we need to wrap up, and of course that's when all the hands go flinging in the air. But we do need to wrap it up. Please bear in mind that all of our three marvellous panellists are available to sign copies of their books. I can commend all three books to you down in the book signing areas. Yeah, I'd pick up yours, Trevor, but you know I got a strain in the wrist last time I did that. Thank you all so much for coming out today and showing that you care about public language and for enjoying the session. And please join me in thanking our panellists.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.